and then we'll just talk about it. Are we ready?
Yep.
It's all up? Okay, you start with your name.
Hi, Richard Zilmer. I'm a retired Lieutenant General of the United States Marine Corps. I was commissioned in 1974, retired in 2011. And along the way, I served in a variety of assignments, as we all do, but perhaps most notably my last couple assignments from 2005, 2006, and 2007, I was the commander of the multinational force in Anbar, Iraq, the Marine Forces. Spent a little over a year there. When I returned in 2007, I was next assigned to 3MEF, 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force in Okinawa, Japan. I served there from 2007 to 2009, and upon my return, I served as the Deputy Commandant for Manpower and Reserve Affairs leading up to my retirement in 2011.
Tell me why you think that America's current energy posture is a national security risk.
Well, I think much like my fellow MAB, the Military Advisory Board members, most of our, if you look at our experience, our collective experience, it begins back in the 70s. So if you look at our posture in 1973 and 74 when the OPEC embargo began and Americans found themselves really at the mercy of OPEC, we had the critical gas, oil shortages, gasoline shortages, the gas lines. You know, that rolled into a series of events that drug America increasingly into the Middle East in order to guarantee the flow of oil and petroleum, not only to the United States, but to the rest of the world. The stand-up of the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force in 1980, the establishment of the Carter Doctrine, the tanker wars that went from 1984 to 1988, and we're seeing that again with security in the Strait of Hormuz, leading up to Desert Shield, Desert Storm in 1991, which was a response to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait based upon oil, rolling into operations Northern Watch, Southern Watch, the bombings of the USS Cole, the bombing of the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, Operation Rocky Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom. We've spent collectively our 30, 40 years plus very focused on the Middle East, much of which has been based upon securing that uninterrupted flow of oil and petroleum. So if you look back over those last 30, 40 years, it raises questions about, one, our foreign policy, but our foreign policy has been very much developed about maintaining that dependence on oil and petroleum to fuel our economies, to fuel the global economies. And if we don't want to keep fighting in the Middle East for the next 30, 40 years, we need to find a way to decrease that dependence and begin to look at alternative energy sources, advanced technologies. And again, it's a big globe. There's a lot of interest areas for the United States in terms of foreign policy, but we don't want to be focused necessarily on the Middle East for the next 30, 40 years.
Why? But we've got like we've got this whole new resource of oil here. I've been hearing that we're going to be independent. We're going to have all we need right here. What's wrong with that picture?
Well, I think again the dependence upon oil is, as we've watched here, despite the fact that the prices have dropped and we've had this newfound wealth of natural gas and fracking for oil. We're still seeing even right now that our imports are increasing over the last 2, 3 years. So that dependence on oil is still there. And because it's a globally priced product, and when it is cut off, as it will at some future point, when that oil is cut off, it's going to bring the rest of the nations of this globe to a standstill. Their economies could come to a standstill. We are a global nation. What affects those nations affects us. So this ever sustaining need for oil is inherently bad, is destructive, and it's going to affect the economies, if not now, certainly in the future.
So where you see a problem, there is also an opportunity. What do you see as the opportunity here?
Well, I think the opportunity is the result of our work has been to look for diversification and further efficiencies in the way we use oil and petroleum. And when we began this trek about 4 or 5 years ago, at least in my experience, it was how do you solve a better use of petroleum, a more informed, more enlightened use of petroleum. And on the outside, we were looking at some of these advanced technologies that, as we said at the time, weren't ready for prime time. And in the last 2 years, despite the fact that we've got fracking and we've got natural gas, we're reducing the dependence. It's not quite as severe as it was a couple of years ago. And where we thought perhaps all the interest in the other technologies would wane, it's done just the opposite. What we're seeing now in solar, wind, geothermal, the evolution of electric vehicles, battery storage increases, it is taking off in a very, very big way, and hugely in a business perspective. So we think the next generation to follow is probably seeing the wisdom of trying to get away from that petroleum, that dependence on petroleum, and trying to find these cleaner, more efficient forms of energy. But I think from a military perspective, from a national security perspective, if we find a way to reduce that dependence, that tether on the petroleum lines, if our forces can be lighter, if they can be faster, if they can stand longer on station and become more lethal, that's our interest, to be a better, more effective military that has these alternative sources of energy that will make us a more effective force.
Is innovation and leading important to Americans' national security?
I believe it is. I think what's important about innovation, it gets back to the roots of what is the root of America. And America is an innovator, America is a leader, we always have been, and we need to be. As we've looked just in this last year alone, the investment, the global investment on renewable energy is somewhere in the order of about $286 billion. We've watched that steadily increase at a more rapid pace in the last 2 years. There's a lot of money there. There's a lot of jobs. There's a lot of technology and innovation. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to cede that to some other competitive nation, as we are doing right now. So there is a lot of money there. There are jobs. There is a future there, and we want to be parts of it. We don't want to be a part of it, I should say. We want to be the leader in that evolution of innovation.
Tell me about the link between the economy and economic security and national security, and how clean energy is important to that.
Well, I think the clean energy potentially, again, we want to reduce that dependence on petroleum and oil. Much of that oil still comes from a number of nations that don't necessarily fall into the favorable, friendly side of American foreign diplomacy. There are nations that are providing that oil, yet we don't want to be dependent upon those nations who may suddenly wake up one day and say, hey, look, we're going to cut off the oil to the free world. We need to have the energy independence that clean energy really provides for us, the opportunity. Like I say, the solar, the wind, the geothermal, all those things represent opportunities to give us greater latitude, greater autonomy in this global community that we live in. So we really want to try to maintain that independence for us, through the use, the adoption of cleaner energies for the future. That's
great. That's great. You're doing great. I'm loving this stuff.
You're going to hear it again tonight, Maury.
Good.
So pretend you just it's the first time you heard it. Okay.
Good. I mean, I think one of the things that's kind of dumbfounding is as you watch this, the prices plummet and the capacity increase. The economics are going to overtake it, and so what is the danger to America if these barriers continue to exist that are regulatory barriers and government barriers because it's not a level playing field? What are the dangers to America, and how is that a danger to national security?
Yeah, what we don't want to have here is a situation where regulation and unfair market practices hinders our ability to make that transition. And as we talk about disruptive technologies, clearly solar and wind is now in that corner. They're in that box, if you will. That's a natural progression. That is business, that is capitalism in the United States. So I think there can be a natural end, if you will, to the coal industry, our dependence on our huge dependence on petroleum and oil. By allowing these forms of energy, these next generation energy forms, let them grow, let them get big. There's business, there's a future there. We're seeing, you know, the job growth in solar, the job growth in wind power in the United States. It's outpacing everything that's happening in the mining world. It's outpacing everything even in the petroleum and the drilling industry that we see in the United States. I mean, this is clearly the future.
Great. You're just great. You're just great.
You just got to edit this right so it looks good more. That's all.
It'll be great. So just one more thing. Can you just tell me, you know, kind of in as short a way as you can, the experience you had in Iraq and what you saw with the fuel convoys?
I think why this appeals to me, or why I was drawn into, after my military career, into this work with energy and renewables, goes back to our experience in 2006 and 2007. During from May, June, July, we saw a huge transformation in the war in Iraq, where American forces clearly were the targets. We were seen then as oppressors and not necessarily the liberators. And we got caught up in the civil war that was waiting to take place in Iraq. And because of the nature of the way we were fighting the fight in Iraq, we had very distant positioning of our forces. We had forward operating bases and combat outposts spread all over Iraq. And in order to maintain those forces, we had to supply them. The biggest product that was required for our support was diesel and water and liquids. And consequently, we had convoys every day going out to the farthest reaches of Iraq. And that's where they became victim or subject targets of what we were finding was this insidious form of improvised explosive devices, IEDs, mine warfare for another name. And our convoys were being increasingly hit because that represented our ability to do the fight. You know, the good news about the American military is it's the greatest, most effective military on the planet. The bad news is it takes a lot of energy for that force to fight. And as we look back over the decades, we see in World War II where it took about 1 gallon per soldier per day to fuel the operations in Europe for our allied forces. Fast forward to where we were in Iraq in 2006, 2007, that figure is now about 22 gallons per soldier per day to fuel our operations at a cost of anywhere from estimates of $50 a gallon to maybe as high as $200 a gallon of fuel to do that. But we needed that diesel fuel to run the generators. The generators were needed to run the air conditioning in the combat operations centers. We needed the electricity to run the repair tools. We needed electricity to run the surveillance cameras. We needed energy to recharge the radios, run the radios. It goes on and on and on and on. And so we have this great thirst for energy, which in turn drove us to bringing more and more and more liquid bulk refueling materials in the form of diesel and, as I said, in water. So in order to reduce that exposure, if you will, we went back to some of our own experience in 29 Palms, California, which in 2004 had the 4th largest photovoltaic field in the Department of Defense. We're only 50 miles from the Coachella Valley, where we have huge wind farms down there, and we said, look, why can't we just kind of re-engineer some of these technologies and bring in renewables? Let's see if we can take off-the-shelf technologies to get wind, to get solar. And in 2006, we submitted back through the chain of command back to Washington, D.C., a joint universal needs statement that really looked to go to commercial off-the-shelf technologies and import those. The idea is then to get our convoys, reduce our dependence on that diesel fuel, reduce the convoys, the number of convoys on the roads, and thereby build a little bit of force protection into the amount of requirements that we had on a daily basis to sustain those forces. And I think as we look in the future, this nature of distributed warfare is going to be with us for decades, and we are going to have increasingly forces that are spread over large geographical separations. So we need to find a way to support, to sustain, to provide the energy to these forces to be able to use all the great communications and weapon systems that we now need for our forces.
That's great. What happened? What happened? What was the end result of your urgent needs statement?
Well, I think in a backhanded way, I think the Joint Universal Needs Statement, it met a bureaucratic death when it got to the Pentagon. But what it did, I believe, is inspire was a great interest in trying to find alternative energy sources. 2009, they stood up the Office for Operational Energy with the first Assistant Secretary of Defense, and Sharon Burke was named to that post. And what we've seen now, when we look back at what our individual services are doing, each of the service chiefs has to talk about energy when they do their annual testimony before Congress. The department heads also have to talk about energy, but we look and see what each of the services are doing in the form of building solar fields, building geothermal, they're adopting renewable portfolio standards. 2025, the goal of the Department of Defense is to be 25% renewable energy at each of our garrisons and bases. We've managed to reduce the amount of petroleum that we're using in our garrison bases here in the States. So it's spawned a whole, I wouldn't say a cottage industry, but there's clearly a focus now in one, reducing costs because we are saving in the long-term expenses, and that's an opportunity cost. For every $10 that raise in a barrel of gas, that's $1.3 billion at the end of that tunnel, if you will. The Department of Defense spends about $15 billion a year on liquid petroleum. That's $15 billion that can't be used for other things, for the next generation aircraft, the next generation weapon system that our Marine sailor soldiers and seamen, our sailors, thank you, are going to need for the next generation. You got to cut that piece out there.
I know, and you're, Denny McGinn isn't gonna like.
I know. He is, but you know,
there's a lot of
but the Navy's really now.
Competition among
The Arizona solar fields that they're building right now, that's a Department of Navy initiative. That's going to provide the goal there is to reduce energy costs by a third over 14 West Coast Navy and Marine bases. That's huge. Kings Bay, Georgia is just building a solar field. So everybody's got it right now.
Well, you also decreased, I saw some statistic about the fuel convoys getting decreased, that they actually did get cut in half or something.
Well, I know there's some Marine experiments where the Expeditionary Forward Operating Base, the XFOB, they were able to reduce the amount of petroleum or diesel fuel that they were using to fuel their operations. So it's out there. I mean, it can happen, but I think even for the small units being able to operate autonomously away from, where they need energy, electric, they can now use these mobile or on-the-go solar panels where they can break those out. Now that's obviously climate dependent. They need to be in the right areas where they can do that. But there are a number of those initiatives now that are all, again, about making this force lighter, more mobile, greater sustainability, and more lethal.
Thank you. You were terrific.
Thanks,
You're
Noreen.
just terrific.
All right.